The Fodderburn mansion stands majestically, its gleaming dome and manicured gardens emphasizing the importance of the coming event. A servant dutifully announces that the young lady has arrived, and several high-ranking men and a maid are waiting for her at the table. Melissa enters the hall, and all eyes turn to her, but her face remains cold and detached. One of the men, without even looking up, dryly remarks that Melissa is late again, showing obvious disdain. Sitting down without the slightest apology, Melissa indifferently parries that she is always late, instantly cutting off the awkward attempt to start a conversation. The atmosphere at the long table remains icy, even the sound of the instruments seeming too loud in this oppressive silence. Melissa's mind flashes back to a banal novel, The Man I Love, with a primitive and predictable plot. The main character of the book was Yuri, a commoner with the gift of magic who was adopted by a baron, giving her a new life. The story revolved around 4 men who were madly in love with Yuri, including the vain crown prince. The suitors also included a cold-hearted sniper, a savage werewolf, and a polite but calculating millionaire. 4 men with different personalities were willing to fight for Yuri's love, because she looked like a saint. Against her shining innocence, Melissa appeared in the shadows, causing despondency by her mere existence in the plot. The novel required the appearance of a villain, not just anyone, but the crown prince's bride, who was intended to play Melissa's role. In addition, she was also supposed to be the older sister of the sniper, increasing her importance in the story. Lastly, the author intended her to be cruel to werewolves, creating additional hatred for herself. Melissa had a nasty relationship with a billionaire, often making enemies with her machinations with forbidden goods. She caustically reminded herself that this body now belonged to Melissa Potterbright, not the naive heroine from the novel. Melissa calmly stated that she had no love or affection for her family, and so the coldness at the table was familiar to her. When she accidentally spilled her food, a servant girl jeeringly asked if the mistress was a pothole, but Melissa only sighed heavily. The servants fidgeted to clean up after her, and Melissa thought with a lazy chuckle that it would only be easier for them without her. Melissa, grinning instead of a duty greeting, asks the Duke why he didn't come himself. She cheekily asks about her white-haired friend, hinting that he may have finally died from his adventures. One of the men calmly replies that he's gone to do his duty, protecting someone, hinting at his irresponsibility. The maid adds in a whisper that Jake is the sole heir, and can't be relied on because he's acting like a child. The man clarifies with a cold chuckle that this heir has no attachment to his family at all, and only runs around the world. Melissa fake laughs and says she'll back off since she's been hinted that her beloved white-haired friend is more important to her. The head maid grumbles under her breath and holds her back, unhappy with Melissa's antics and her impertinent jokes. Melissa admits to herself that she is angry at the past mistress of this body for all the negativity she has accumulated. Looking back at her former life, she realizes that compared to the hell of studying and the constant stress, everything here is bearable. If it hadn't been for the accident, Melissa is sure that in that life she would have gotten hypertension because of new assignments and nervousness. After the accident, Melissa woke up inside the novel, realizing that she had escaped from the school hell into a new world. The first thing she noticed about her new body was a shockingly wide forehead that was hard to ignore. Her golden, narrow and piercing eyes resembled sharp blades, giving her gaze a menacing look. Melissa acidically compared her reflection to a dog named Yellowway, who had lived next door in a previous life. She decided that she could handle it, because Melissa's fate in the novel, though tragic, was not the worst. Melissa, as a true daughter of the Duke, looked resplendent, enjoying her new position in the world. She was adamant that she would not act like a classic villain and bully the main character. Though Melissa realized that just being a good girl wasn't enough to change her reputation, she wasn't interested in creating a harem of 4 men, as the plot had intended. The main thing was to avoid doing anything villainous, and then her life in this world promised to be awesome. Melissa is diligently writing a letter at her desk, pondering each word to get it right. She leans on her hand thoughtfully, pondering how to phrase her thoughts politely so as not to arouse unnecessary suspicion. In the letter, she falsely expresses her sincere concern for the dear crown prince, making the quill dance across the paper. Melissa realizes that the recipient of her letter is the very crown prince she can't stand. In the portrait, Crown Prince Ian Vasilis shines with his fake beauty, which hides his real self. Melissa begins the letter politely, describing the beautiful weather and blooming gardens to set a light mood. She smiles with feigned sincerity, carefully tracing the words with her quill, so as not to arouse suspicion. Clutching the quill tighter, Melissa abruptly makes her main move, satisfyingly placing a bold period at the end of the sentence. In the text, she clearly and without unnecessary embellishments, she asks for the annulment of her and the Crown Prince's engagement. Appreciating her work, Melissa nods smugly, deciding that the word please was particularly polite. Melissa decides with a cold stare that the first step to freedom should be to get rid of the Crown Prince. She adds a caustic innuendo to the letter, mentioning flowers and another girl with whom he has spent nights. Angry at the prince's hypocrisy, Melissa begins to write one letter after another, venting her rage. The maid looks on in horror as she writes the 49th letter of the day. At the end, Melissa snidely suggests that if he likes the atmosphere of the estate, he should marry Jake. Melissa, having finished another version of the letter, pretends that she accidentally wrote too harshly. She smiles smugly, noting that her handwriting is still perfect, as a duke's daughter should be. Without wasting a second, she hands the letter to the maid and orders it to be sent to the imperial palace on behalf of the prince's fiancé. The maid casts a weary glance at the letter, which again has her usual caustic acrimony. With a sigh, she reminds Melissa that she has already asked 8 times for the engagement to be annulled, but she remains steadfast. Melissa warns the maid that if she doesn't get an answer again, she'll make an even bigger scandal than the last time. Before leaving, she sternly orders the maid not to disappear, leaving her to have the last word. As soon as the door slams behind her, Melissa grinningly allows herself a small victory pause. Upon reflection, she frowns, realizing that the maid clearly doesn't see her as a mistress, but rather as an adventurous friend. Sighing, Melissa turns her thoughts elsewhere and decides to get busy choosing an outfit for her future meeting with Yuri. Melissa finishes the letter requesting the engagement annulment, determined to get rid of this burden. Her irritation grows, as she is tired of the pretense and constant humiliation. She recalls the disgusting scene of the Crown Prince flirting with another woman right in front of her eyes. She recalls that this smug Crown Prince, Ian Vasilis, was considered her official fiancé. All this chaos occurs on the day she meets Yuri, the novel's protagonist, whom Melissa is about to visit. Under the pretext of finding true love, the Crown Prince and Yuri went their separate ways to avoid formalities. Ian had shameless fun with other women, constantly getting into scandals and defaming his name. Until he met Yuri, he was only adding to his reputation, turning it into a string of endless problems. Melissa remembered with disdain how he'd tried to flirt with her by feigning a fake crush. When Ian made the excuse that any man would be a beast in front of Melissa, she shuddered in disgust. Melissa watched in disgust as the prince and his new lover acted, as if they'd found each other after a long separation. They unashamedly hugged and kissed right in front of her eyes as if she didn't exist at all. Melissa realized with a stone face that to Ian she was nothing more than an accessory, devoid of feelings. She used to think his misdeeds were limited to drinking and miserable loneliness. But seeing him riding his horse at night, drunkenly humming love songs, had finally convinced her of his nastiness. Melissa hadn't expected all of Ian's heavy character to turn out to be trite love talk in the style of cheap romance novels. When Yuri asked in surprise who she was, Melissa only grinned, boiling with indignation inside. Her blatant "Acha" was filled with such rage that a heavy silence hung in the room for a moment. Melissa clenched her fist, realizing that Yuri was either blind or purposely ignoring the obvious superiority in front of her. Her jeweled outfit made it clear that a maid was out of the question. Without even thinking to explain himself, Ian dismissively told Yuri to ignore Melissa. Melissa turns around and is horrified to realize that they are nearly naked and about to strip even more. As Ian began to pull off the rest of his clothes, she thought in a stupor, "What kind of devil is he?" As she stood in shock at their noisy kissing, her mind screamed that it was time for a scandal. But then Melissa sharply berated herself. Why the hell was she even holding back in the face of this embarrassment? Melissa starts making a list in her head of reasons why what is happening is completely absurd. Starting with the fact that they are in the Crown Prince's reception room. The second was that Ian had brought this woman in at all, unbeknownst to her, as if his position allowed anything. The third was that the bastard was quietly flirting with another right in front of her without even trying to hide. The fourth thing that pissed her off the most was that Melissa had come here at Ian's invitation. And the fifth was the scene from her memory where Ian had made her carry a bunch of heavy books for his whim. Melissa grimly notes that such humiliating scenes with Ian have happened more than once or twice. To summarize, she firmly decides for herself, Ian Vasilis is the worst mistake of her life. In her mind, he is now firmly associated with an insolent dog who doesn't deserve the slightest respect. Melissa was convinced there was no point in holding back or behaving in front of such a lowlife. Squinting coldly, she calmly hurls a single word in Ian's face. Trash. Ian, hearing the insult, turned around dumbfounded, paying Melissa any attention at all for the first time in a long time. Confusion flashed in his eyes as he saw her cold and contemptuous stare in the reflection. Melissa noted with quiet joy that she had finally gotten the arrogant bastard to pay attention to her. With the most polite expression on her face, she reminded him of her question. I asked, is your highness trash? It was no wonder Ian was confused. After all, he had been messing around with other women shamelessly during their entire engagement. Every time Melissa saw such a scene, she didn't hold back and mercilessly pulled her rival's hair. With a cry of how dare you seduce his highness, she would make a spectacular scandal right on the spot. Ian acted as if he had nothing to do with it, pretending that he had nothing to do with it. In fact, it was Ian who was the real culprit in all this cheap melodrama and shameful scenes. Amidst this bacchanalia, Ian, with a cheeky raised eyebrow, dares to ask if Melissa has lost her mind. Melissa calmly says that if anyone here is crazy, it's Ian and his absurd life. He starts yelling, accusing her of trying to put on a show about infidelity right in the palace. Melissa coldly remarks that, if anything, she's quite sane for not throwing an ashtray at him. Of all the male characters in the novel, Ian was the one she most sincerely detested. And that was because he consistently behaved like this, obnoxious, insolent, and without the slightest respect. Melissa mockingly asks Ian if he really thinks she could ever fall in love with him like she did in the novel. At his awkward silence, all she wanted to do was roll her eyes and get rid of this pathetic sight as soon as possible. Ian, sensing the situation is getting out of hand, starts babbling excuses about her difficult character. He also dares to complain that he didn't expect to hear such cruel words right in front of him. Melissa listens to his ramblings with icy indifference and thinks languidly, what the hell is he talking about? Melissa thinks with cold fury that Ian seriously thinks he's a good person, despite his disgusting behavior. Clenching her fists, she angrily wonders if she should tell him something really cruel to make him understand. With a smirk, she suggests, since he was so good at wallowing on the floor with the others, maybe she should seal his face to the floor. Ian reflexively pulls back when he sees the clear threat in Melissa's eyes and readiness to act. Melissa, noticing his strange reaction, becomes alarmed and mentally wonders, what's he up to again? Ian's chin trembled, as if he could barely contain his fear of impending retribution for his antics. His face suddenly had the look of a pitiful fawn on it, as if he were an innocent victim rather than a brazen traitor. The one who had cheated behind her back without remorse was now shaking after hearing just one accusation against him. Ian had always secretly feared Melissa's rage, because he was smart enough to realize what she was capable of. Smiling with cold determination, Melissa threw him to the floor, snarling that he deserved it thoroughly. Melissa observes with a sneer that even though she's been reborn as an aristocrat, she's not going to be a doormat for the sake of other people's expectations. Shrugging, she decides that if everything is already clear, there's no point in continuing with pointless ceremonies. Ian, not losing his nerve, offers to marry him since she despises him so much, as if it were a normal proposal. Melissa only chuckles, imagining that their life after the wedding would look like a child's game of get along. But in the back of her mind she realizes that this idiot will not dare to do anything serious for a long time anyway. According to the plot of the novel, Ian was supposed to fall madly in love with Yuri and forget about everyone else. In the end, he had to happily demand Melissa break off their engagement to be with Yuri. This should have come as a real shock to Melissa, because in the book she really loved Ian. She should have mourned the breakup, clinging to the remnants of the relationship and refusing to accept reality. In the script, Melissa was supposed to throw a tantrum, grabbing papers and sobbing that she didn't want to break up. Later, Ian was supposed to publicly humiliate Melissa by throwing her away like trash and ruining her life. But now Melissa was determined that it would never happen to her, and was ready for anything. She wondered, why could her former version even love Ian, who had only dishonored her? In fact, she didn't have a single reason to hold on to this smug traitor. The only reason Ian continued to act like a lowlife was because he wanted Melissa herself to initiate the breakup. Ian had hated Melissa from the beginning, because all they had in common was a lucrative political engagement. No matter how many times he'd asked to break the engagement, the old Melissa had always clung stubbornly to him. In fact, it was predictable. Ian was about to meet Yuri and fall head over heels in love with her. Since it was going to happen that way, Melissa decided to let fate take its course and let him go to Yuri. She thought with a smile that even if she broke up earlier than in the original, it certainly wouldn't be any worse. Melissa happily decided to stay away from Yuri and avoid the sad fate of the novel. She reminded herself that, as the Duke's daughter, she could afford to live a quiet life without unnecessary drama. Breaking up with Ian would in no way ruin her chances for a decent marriage or a normal future, especially since she never wanted to tie her life too much to family intrigue. So even if her fiancé was the crown prince, it meant exactly nothing to her. Melissa grinned and decided that breaking up with Ian wasn't a problem at all, but pure pleasure. Stepping closer, she calmly declared that it was time to end this farce right here and now. With icy determination in her voice, she uttered, "Let's break up." Looking him straight in the eye, Ian and his bed companion stared at her in a daze, as if unable to believe their ears. He, turning pale, asked in bewilderment if he had misheard about the parting. Confident that she'd told Ian everything he wanted to hear, Melissa was about to go home. But the moment she turned to go, a shaky voice suddenly called out a short, "No, you can't," from behind her. Ian, suddenly snapping out of it, shouted that she had no right to just walk away from him like that. Melissa stopped dumbfounded, unable to understand why someone who had longed for a breakup was suddenly outraged. Ian sat on the bed in utter confusion, trying to realize how things had gotten so out of his control. Ian's mistress shouted after him in a panic, clearly not understanding why he was suddenly ignoring her. The crown prince himself, who was usually courteous to women, was so confused that he unconsciously pushed her aside. Melissa, watching this farce, only grinned to herself. Well, who could have expected such a reaction from him? She stepped closer and asked him coldly what he meant by his pathetic, "You can't." Ian mumbled something inarticulate, unable to get out a normal answer. Ian stared at Melissa in bewilderment, demanding an explanation for why she was suddenly talking about breaking up. His confused words only made her angrier, because all along he'd been the one who'd wanted to end their engagement. Holding back her anger, Melissa grinned coldly, and Riley asked him if that was what he wanted so badly. He stood completely confused, stupidly silent, as if he had suddenly forgotten all his previous intentions. Melissa thought angrily that with that look on his face, he clearly had no intention of breaking up himself. Melissa wondered if perhaps in this story Ian wasn't supposed to fall in love with Yuri at all. There was a strange confusion in his actions, as if he didn't know which girl he wanted. This thought confused her so much that she was beginning to wonder what was going on here. In a daze, she tried to put the pieces together in her head, but the situation was only getting more confusing. Ian was standing across from her, red-faced, shaking nervously, and clearly unable to speak properly. Ian suddenly shouted loudly that he didn't want to break up, as if someone were threatening him with a knife to his throat. Melissa squinted her eyes and grinned to herself, realizing that it appeared he hadn't wanted to break off the relationship all this time. With a lazy smile, she wondered if he was into weird stuff like public cheating for adrenaline. When Ian tried to deny it in a panic, she calmly added that there was no other way to explain his behavior. Ian, utterly confused, just kept silent, unable to justify himself to her cold-blooded gaze. Melissa, smiling crookedly, realized that Ian just wanted to humiliate her, without any deeper meaning. She laughed lightly, as if she realized something obvious, and Ian only stammered, trying to justify himself. As he stepped closer, Melissa coldly observed that, although the method was sneaky, he still managed to piss her off. She grinned bitterly, remembering how she had once naively believed she truly loved this man. Meanwhile, Ian's mistress, still in bed, watched their strange conversation with bewilderment. Melissa, holding back tears, threw in that even a poderbrate bitch could feel pain. Ian remained silent, not knowing what to say in response to her frank words. She remembered clearly how old Melissa had suffered his cheating and humiliation. In her memories, she always saw herself as a little stubborn girl fighting for respect. Ian's scandalous affairs with other women only reinforced her contempt and determination to change everything. Melissa was angry that her cruelty and stupidity were considered natural qualities of a crown prince's bride. Under the constant pressure of judgmental stares, she had to live surrounded by perpetual rumors and criticism. Even the servants whispered behind her back, hiding their contempt under a mask of politeness. She was used to walking the corridors with her head down, silently enduring pain and humiliation. In her former life, her family had also brought only pain, blaming her for every misfortune and failure. When a man cheated, it was always the woman's fault, both in Korea and in the world of this novel. Melissa tiredly thought that no matter how much countries and eras changed, the attitude toward women remained the same. She glared at Ian, who couldn't utter a single intelligible excuse, only stammering under her hard gaze. Ian flared up with anger and yelled, accusing Melissa of being the one to provoke him first. Ridiculous scenes flashed through Melissa's imagination where they both looked like a silly couple having absurd fights in front of everyone. Melissa chuckled wryly as she remembered how she had portrayed a pie girl for her fiancé's sake, but in the end it was all for nothing. Ian stammered, trying to make himself look like a victim, but her cold stare told him she didn't believe him one bit. He pulled a faintly innocent expression on his face, as if he were trying to trick a child, but he only looked pathetic. In a calm voice, Melissa agreed with what he said, but immediately Riley reminded him who had first broken their relationship. She held her head high and with a bitter smile through that all her actions were only due to her sincere love for her fiancé. Ian looked back at their tea parties and hugs together with an important look, as if that was proof of great love. Melissa listened stone-faced as he excused himself, inwardly rolling her eyes at the silliness of it all. She apologized politely, pretending to be terribly sorry if her behavior had suddenly embarrassed him. In the back of her mind, she only thought angrily that this moron had completely lost his shame and common sense. Ian, however, completely unaware of how pathetic he looked, continued to nod with the look of a hurt child. Melissa held her head, wondering how anyone could be so absurd that her ears were ringing. Ian shrieked in response to her accusations, justifying that it didn't give her the right to call him a womanizer. She jabbed her finger at him angrily, demanding that he explain why he was pursuing other women then. Melissa grinned wryly, scoffing at the fact that she had uncovered the crown prince's own secret vice. And every time Ian asked her out, she only wryly noted that he had arranged it all himself. Melissa had spent the entire day choosing the best outfit for the meeting with a happy twinkle in her eye. The maids helped her with the preparations, noticing how happily she glowed with anticipation. Every time she dressed up, Melissa hoped this time would be different. But instead of a warm welcome, she was once again greeted by scenes of Ian flirting with another woman. And even afterward, Melissa grudgingly couldn't refuse when he called for her again. Melissa lowered her gaze demurely, hiding her resentment and weariness at the nonsense behind her smile. She wondered how, after all his actions, Ian still had the nerve to cling to the betrothal. Raising an eyebrow in mild irritation, Melissa asked how he was so sure she wouldn't leave. Ian calmly stated as if it were simple. The reason was her love for him, as if it were obvious. Melissa froze in place, looking at him with blank amazement, as if for the first time she doubted his sanity. Melissa was stunned at Ian's words, silently staring at him with a face of blank bewilderment. Her gaze darkened for a moment, and her fingers frantically clutched the heavy glass ashtray on the table. A daring thought flashed through her mind, the idea of throwing the thing right into his forehead without further ado. She struggled to keep herself from impulsive action, casting one last cold glance at the silent object. In desperation, Melissa mentally appealed to common sense, asking for help from Immanuel Kant himself. Melissa mentally cursed all the philosophers who had once claimed that man was capable of rational thought. Holding back her rage, she rubbed her fists angrily, radiating an aura of gloom around her that made the air seem to freeze. Ian stared at her with a frightened look, unable to understand what exactly he had done wrong again. Memories of his constant cheating, and his brazen attempts to blame it on herself flashed through her mind. She could barely contain her laughter at the absurdity of what was happening, comparing Ian to the hero of some naive song about eternal love. Ian froze in shock when he heard Melissa coldly admit that she didn't love him anymore. When he tried to question her words, she calmly clarified that she meant it. Melissa didn't hesitate to repeat that her feelings were completely gone, offering not the slightest hope. Ian jerked awkwardly, as if unable to believe that what he'd been running from for so long had become a reality. She took a few steps back, confidently declaring that she felt no love for him at all. Ian had thought Melissa had given herself to him completely when she professed her love, filling her heart with only him. However, everything changed when she looked at him with a cold expression while saying his name. Melissa made it clear that her feelings were no longer the same as before, that a change had come. Ian, shocked, couldn't believe her words had changed so drastically, wondering what had happened. She hadn't been shy about expressing to him that love wasn't just about feelings. It was about so much more than that. Melissa coldly ordered the engagement to be broken off, unwilling to put up with this farce any longer. Clenching her fists, she furiously asked if he thought it wise to hold on to a loveless relationship. Prince Ian stared at her confused, unable to find an answer. Frustrated, he stood half naked, not realizing how he had brought things to this point. Melissa, rising in all her pride, didn't even look in his direction, leaving him looking miserable. Melissa was getting angrier and angrier, barely able to contain her irritation at yet another conversation. She was determined to get rid of her status as the crown prince's bride, which only hindered her. Looking at Ian laughing carefree, she was only more convinced of how unworthy he was of the throne. In her mind, she pictured the disaster that would inevitably happen if such a fool became emperor. Ian himself was panicking and begging her not to break the engagement, shaking with fear of the consequences. Melissa grudgingly admitted that Ian's face was indeed handsome, but she quickly added to herself that he was nothing but a pathetic womanizer without a shred of dignity. All her respect and pity for him had long ago evaporated without a trace. While she could tolerate his stupidity, there was one boundary he had no right to cross. Annoyed beyond belief, Melissa exploded, demanding that they finally break off this idiotic engagement. Ian, stammering and blushing, tried in vain to justify himself to a cold Melissa. Melissa rolled her eyes, feeling her blood pressure skyrocket again, because of his stupidity. One of the maids of honor was cautiously peeking at the awkward scene, not knowing whether to intervene or not. Deciding it was best to get her feet away, she quietly crept toward the exit, trying not to attract attention. But at the last moment her movements caught the eye, and she froze in place with a strained smile. With a cry, the maid of honor slipped and collapsed to the floor, toppling everything around her. Ian and Melissa turned around at the same time, dumbfounded by the sudden confusion. A metal tray crashed to the floor with a clang, adding to the chaos in the room. Soldiers came running to the noise, concerned by the shouting and rumbling outside the door. Melissa, irritably surveying the mayhem, only snorted as she saw everyone around her wallowing on the floor. One of the knights worriedly asked Ian if he was all right as he wrinkled his nose in pain. Melissa stood back, puzzled as to why they were even making such a fuss over nothing. The enraged knight rushed towards her, demanding an explanation for the chaos that was going on. Unable to stand his insolence, Melissa caught his arm and stopped his attempt to grab her. She shouted out indignantly, not understanding why she was the one being blamed for this mess. Melissa held back tears, angry not only at the situation but at her own powerlessness. There were shards of a glass ashtray on the floor, broken in the chaos. The guards were talking amongst themselves, unsure how to react to what was happening. Ian's maid of honor cried on the floor, hysterical. Ian held his head tiredly, realizing that his status was only getting worse because of all the confusion. Melissa was raging in the room so violently that no one wanted to get close to her. She shouted indignantly, realizing that she had been misunderstood and made to look guilty again. She rubbed her bruised arm angrily, wishing she could take her anger out. Fixing her hair, Melissa said sarcastically that she hadn't done anything wrong. But the next moment she was startled when something went wrong again. Maid of honor Linda sobbed in Ian's arms, playing the innocent victim scene in front of everyone. Ian gently soothed her, repeating that he was sorry for what had happened and promising to protect her. Melissa watched this spectacle in disgust, not believing a word they said. She grinned, realizing that everyone was carefully making her out to be the villain for no good reason. Feeling alone, Melissa clenched her fists, realizing that no one was on her side in this game. Melissa was being dragged forcefully down the hallway, and she realized that resisting would only hurt her. Once on the floor, she clenched her teeth in helplessness, vowing to herself not to endure any more humiliation. Ian, meanwhile, was coddling Linda, playing the caring and impeccable prince. Melissa grimly realized that Ian had never once even apologized for all the embarrassment he had caused. With rage in her eyes, She screamed that she would never forgive him for everything he had done to her. The carriage drove Melissa slowly away from the palace, its hoofs clattering on the sidewalk. Inside, she sat silent, holding back her rage and wondering if she should kill Ian with her own hands. Taking a deep breath, however, Melissa decided that her decision should not be based on emotion. She was angry at how rudely she'd been treated, as if she'd been dragged out of the palace as unwanted trash. She was greeted at home with a cautious question about her return, and Melissa replied briefly that she was back. Even the coachman looked at Melissa with pity, as if to say she was in trouble again. The little page respectfully offered to help her, noticing her distressed state. In her mind, Melissa wondered where the reign of an idiot like Ian would lead her. Ian, meanwhile, waved cheerfully to the crowd, naively believing that everyone still loved him. People, blinded by his fake smile, laughed, unaware of the real nightmare. Melissa envisioned how her mad love for Ian would turn into utter chaos for the country. Even meeting Yuri, a kind and sweet girl, would hardly fix his stupidity. In his dreams, Ian ridiculously confessed his love to Yuri, clutching pink hearts in his hands. In reality, even Yuri, realizing his inadequacy, would push him away in horror. Sometimes Ian feigned concern for Melissa, but even at those moments she could barely contain a chuckle. At public receptions, Melissa had to play the perfect couple with Ian. With glass in hand, she stood beside him, maintaining the mask of the flawless bride. Ian, smiling dazzlingly, easily misled others with his false charm. Those smiles only created more misunderstandings, making everyone think Melissa was in love. So he was cleverly playing on her feelings, pretending to be a caring fiancé in front of everyone. Melissa clenched her fists, deciding that she would never let such an imposter get close to Yuri. A single answer was born in her mind: Ian's unexpected elimination. She grinned, deciding that killing was just another job for the villainess. As she thought about the plan, Melissa realized that the Crown Prince's elimination would have to be handled with extreme caution. Meanwhile, her carriage waited peacefully outside, unaware of the dark thoughts brewing inside. The little henchman clumsily jumped off the carriage, slamming to the ground. Whistling merrily, he had no idea what thoughts were swirling in his mistress' mind. As he approached the carriage, he cheerfully informed Melissa of his arrival, but soon froze in bewilderment. Melissa, immersed in dark fantasies of revenge, whispered dark plans to herself. The henchman froze in horror as he saw the real aura of the villain emanating from her. Melissa pensively stepped out of the carriage, not yet fully back to reality. She asked the page in surprise when they had arrived, as if waking up from a dream. With feigned innocence, Melissa clapped her hands together in surprise. When she gave her hand to the page, she noticed his fingers trembling with fear. The henchman himself furtively cast worried glances at her, not understanding what demon had awakened in her. The henchman hesitantly called out to Melissa, about to say something important. Blushing with fear, he hesitated, not knowing how to get his point across. Finally, almost crying, he blurted out that it was wrong to cut off people's limbs so recklessly. Melissa looked at him silently with a face as if she was seriously considering that option. The henchman turned even paler, whispering to himself under his breath whether he would be fired after saying that. Melissa grinned slightly, realizing that the henchman seemed to be worried about her. The confused henchman called out to her anxiously, not realizing what she was thinking. Melissa thought with a sly smile that soon it wouldn't be her who would suffer, but Ian. The henchman turned pale as he looked at her frightening gaze, sensing the impending trouble. Panicked, he began to beg her for mercy, crying for his wife, his pet rabbit, and his own life. The henchman lay on the floor, crying and swearing that he had only looked at Melissa. The maid, noticing the commotion, ran up in a panic, defending the poor man and begging for mercy. Meanwhile, the library was silent among the neatly arranged books. At the desk sat a man with a serious face, working intently on papers. He frowned slightly when he heard the knock on the door, sensing that his calm was coming to an end. Melissa politely asked for some time to have a serious conversation. Moving closer, she stopped in front of the table, waiting for permission to begin. Melissa's father sighed demurely, inwardly preparing for another storm. He set the papers aside, realizing that this conversation would not be a normal one. In fact, Melissa had come to speak not just as a daughter, but as someone who was no longer going to be silent. Melissa stood in front of her father, Duke Podbrath, feeling his heavy gaze. She sighed quietly, thinking about how tired she was of cocking her head upwards looking at him. Though she was quite tall herself, she seemed almost petite next to her father. She wondered how tall her father was, if she had to tilt her head so far back. The image was complemented by his imposing appearance and intimidating expression, which gave her frostbite. Looking at her father, Melissa realized that their stern facial expressions were just the same. Her father briefly asked why she had come, without changing his stone seriousness. His gaze was so penetrating, it seemed the walls would tremble at the mere question. In her thoughts, Melissa remembered how fantasy novels often portrayed men as arrogant and cruel. Those same stories painted women as secondary characters, always standing in the shadow of great heroes. Duke Podbrat had always fit the cruel stereotypes of fantasy stories about overbearing fathers. Melissa had realized from childhood that her bitterness had not grown from nothing. He never even looked in her direction, as if she didn't exist to him. He gave all his attention and care to Jake, his youngest son. The Duke not only adored Jake, but also sent him to study abroad, putting all his hopes in him. Over time, a hatred for her father grew in Melissa's heart that she could no longer hide. Their relationship broke down to the point where they stopped talking to each other. Even now, standing across from each other, they looked at each other with cold detachment. The Duke listened to her in silence, showing no interest or emotion. When he turned away, Melissa threw a few sharp words back at him in irritation. Melissa looked at her father's back in confusion, not realizing if he had heard her words. She thought that maybe he had chosen to ignore her, as if she wasn't addressing him. Realizing this only made her angrier, reawakening an old grudge. Raising her voice, Melissa called out to him, demanding that he finally pay attention to her. Without even turning around, the Duke coldly said he wasn't in the mood for her either. Melissa pressed on, saying that she had come on important business and asked him to give her some time. Her words made the Duke freeze in place, listening to her seriously for the first time in a long time. He turned around in slight surprise, not expecting such directness from his daughter. Melissa quickly added that she wouldn't waste his time and would get right to the point. But at the last moment she stammered, suddenly realizing that she hadn't thought out how to start the conversation. The Duke was surprised to learn that Melissa was really going to discuss important matters in the hallway. He sharply stated that he would not allow her to embarrass the family and suggested that she move to the living room to talk. Melissa was confused, not expecting such seriousness from him, and began to object weakly. The Duke didn't wait for a response and calmly headed to another part of the mansion. Melissa, confused, wondered why he was even bothering for her. Melissa thought irritably that all she wanted was to cancel the damn engagement as soon as possible. It suddenly dawned on her that her father might actually be going to listen to her. She watched in shock as the Duke slowly poured himself water, as if it were a scene from a cheap drama. Sighing, Melissa muttered to herself that the whole thing seemed ridiculous and drawn out. When he finally came closer, she braced herself for the strangest conversation of her life. The Duke coldly said that Melissa only had 5 minutes to talk. After a second, he changed his mind and actually reduced that time to 0, not even hiding his irritation. Melissa only stared at him silently, inwardly boiling with rage and powerlessness. Without waiting for a response, the Duke silently turned around and left the room again. Melissa was even angrier, not understanding what he had in mind or why he was doing this. Melissa thought darkly that she would rather be killed by her father before she could finish off the crown prince. The feeling that the Duke was pushing her to her limits on purpose had become almost unbearable. She sighed heavily, realizing that she was once again in a situation with no chance for a normal conversation. The invitation to the drawing room reminded her of the last time the crown prince had trapped her. With a grim premonition, Melissa knocked on the door, preparing for the worst. After being allowed to enter, Melissa cautiously opened the door, trying to stay alert. She froze on the threshold when she saw that the entire room was strewn with pink balloons and ribbons. Embarrassed, Melissa involuntarily asked if the Potterbrat family was hiding any more strange secrets. Her father coldly replied that there was no one else in the family besides the 3 of them, ignoring the whole ridiculous setting. Melissa wondered in despair why he was acting so calmly, as if he didn't see this horrible circus. Cakes and tea were neatly placed on the table in front of her, and the Duke coldly told her to sit down. Melissa could hardly contain a smirk as she noticed her father flaunting a ridiculous pink suit. But when he looked at her seriously, the absurdity of the situation became 10 times more frightening. He repeated her name calmly, demanding that she focus and stop stalling. Melissa whined in thought, realizing that she had almost snapped and accused him of insanity out loud. Melissa slowly sank down onto the couch, feeling the whole entourage of the room pressing down on her. Pulling herself together, she decided to quickly state her case and leave immediately. She honestly admitted that she just wanted to say what needed to be said and leave this place as soon as possible. The Duke nonchalantly suggested she enjoy her tea and treats first, as if meetings with him were a regular occurrence. Melissa laughed strangely, quickly declining because she knew instinctively that it was best not to linger. Melissa was about to make her main point, but the Duke suddenly interrupted her. He remarked nonchalantly that the tea he'd chosen was popular among the young. Melissa cringed, realizing he was once again ignoring her words as if she weren't even here. She watched her father grimly as he poured something into the cup, wondering if he'd put poison in it. To her surprise, he didn't even drink the tea, but calmly sipped the black coffee as if nothing had happened. Melissa stared at the cup in front of her with a trembling hand, inwardly preparing herself for the worst. She glanced furtively at her father, who looked too calm for this strange setting. Suspicion was growing by the second, and she thought the whole scene smelled like a trap. Melissa frantically thought of ways to get out of it and not drink the suspicious tea. At that moment, the Duke calmly opened his mouth, about to get to the point of the conversation. Melissa gathered her courage and offered to get straight to the point, so that everything would be over as soon as possible. The Duke suddenly remarked thoughtfully that it had been almost 10 years since their normal conversation. She stared at him in surprise, not sure what he was even getting at. Melissa sarcastically reminded him that they actually had breakfast together every morning, and even said hello. In response, her father just looked at her in silence, clearly not sharing her point of view. Melissa realized with a grim face that her father wasn't even listening to her, absorbed in his own thoughts. She sighed heavily, realizing what a pointless attempt at human conversation this was. Gaining her resolve, Melissa stated firmly that she was going to be frank with him. But at the same instant, someone opened the door sharply, and the whole room shuddered with the sudden noise. Melissa turned to the source of the noise before she could speak, feeling the new chaos rising. The door swung open with a clatter, and a guy in a dark robe literally flew into the room, not bothering to be polite. From above, it looked as if a storm had blown into the neat room, and Melissa and the Duke froze in confusion. The stranger looked around the hall with a heavy gaze and sarcastically wondered what the hell was going on here. Melissa rubbed her temple tiredly and asked sourly if he was going to knock at all. The guy silently ignored her question, not showing the slightest hint of remorse. Jake Podbrate, Melissa's younger brother, appeared before them, exuding cold confidence and dangerous charisma. Melissa had thrown in a wry quip that the prodigal son had come home after all. He was beside Yuri now, showing her a showy attention that instantly alerted Melissa. In truth, Jake wasn't just the heir to the duchy. Behind him stood the shadow of an imperial mercenary sniper. Everyone who had ever dared to oppose the imperial family had mysteriously died, and Jake was always behind those deaths. Melissa glared at Jake in silence, trying to figure out why he'd come at all. Jake asked her indifferently why she was wasting her time with meaningless conversation. He actually despised Melissa, and that attitude was clear without words. Despite his youth, Jake had already gained fame as one of the best mages and snipers in the Empire. Despite his great reputation, Jake almost never appeared at public events, avoiding the lights and crowds. When Jake was forced to appear at receptions, he hid in a corner, wrapped in a black cloak. He always avoided showing his face in public, causing more rumors and speculation. Melissa remembered looking for Jake all over the mansion as a child, but he always disappeared. He was always traveling, never staying home for long. And looking at him from the outside, Melissa realized that, with his looks, he was really better off avoiding attention. Melissa was angry at the injustice of Jake inheriting all his looks and talent and none of hers. It pissed her off that even next to her, Jake looked as if there could be no kinship between them. The novel had described him as a cold, handsome man who hated talking to people. Yet behind all that indifference was his gentle habit of secretly watching Yuri, guarding her from afar. But now there was something new in his gaze that confused Melissa and made her wary. Melissa could barely contain her irritation as she watched this strange scene with a stone face. She pointed at the endless ribbons, demanding an explanation as to why the room had turned into a ridiculous fairground. Jake nearly exploded with anger, assuring her that even a 1-year-old toddler would reject such tastelessness. Tasting the tea, he grimaced in disgust, recognizing from the smell that it was cheap street drink. He waved it away and threw it back in his father's direction, saying he didn't want to go home because of the embarrassment. Melissa grinned at him, not believing his father's trickery in the slightest. Jake was mercilessly destroying the atmosphere, and her father only made more excuses in response, as if he were in a rap battle. Tired of the endless criticism, Jake turned around, throwing back an accusation of perpetual deafness to his words. He coldly reminded him that he'd pointed out the stupidity of his father's ideas more than once, but he'd continued to make a mess of things anyway. Desperate, his father muttered that he'd wanted to make the room nice for Melissa's sake, but he'd obviously overdone it. Melissa blinked in confusion, not immediately realizing where this absurdity was going. Realizing the train of thought, she squinted her eyes and tiredly clarified whether she was now really the one to blame. Rolling her eyes, Melissa clutched her head, realizing that even Jake managed to annoy her more than the prince. Thinking back to the book, she was angry. Where was the cold, flawless Jake she'd admired from afar? Though she knew Jake hated both her and her father, seeing it with her own eyes was especially nasty. Melissa slapped her forehead in frustration, unable to believe how different Jake was from the man she'd imagined him to be. She clenched her fists, feeling thoughts of Jake's old image hammering at her head. Even her father, who she was used to seeing as overbearing, now looked like he was silently submitting to his son's every outburst. Melissa hurriedly pulled herself together and, smiling strainedly, decided to think about the situation in a more positive way. Laughing awkwardly, she turned timidly to Jake, hoping that at least now he would show some common sense. Jake looked at Melissa blankly, responding to her attempt to speak with a cold, "What?" There was a heavy silence in the room, all three of them frozen in their seats, as if the stage were frozen in anticipation of the next move. Melissa, at a loss, remembered how he'd been talking non-stop just a moment ago, but now he'd limited himself to one dry phrase. Trying not to give away her irritation, she smiled strainedly, deciding it was best to just stay calm for now. Melissa folded her arms, feigning nonchalance, and asked why Jake had come here. Jake stared at Melissa silently, as if he wasn't even going to start a conversation. She nervously asked why he'd come, but he didn't answer, just bowed his head slightly, as if he were thinking about something of his own. Melissa watched him stunned, feeling the irritation building inside at the cold silence. She thought grimly that he always acted differently, and concluded that he was just ignoring her. Jake snorted briefly, turning away as if to make it clear that he didn't care about her questions. Melissa explained with a strained smile that she had business with the Duke, hoping Jake would take the hint and leave. She squinted at him, furtively checking to see if he'd caught on to her desire to get rid of him. Her back tensed, and she mentally prayed that he would finally leave, but Jake just continued to stand there silently. He stared coldly at Melissa, as if considering whether to waste words on her at all. When he did speak, demanding polite treatment, Melissa indifferently parried with a short and snappish "You, so what?" Melissa watched in bewilderment as Jake suddenly thrust his hand forward, as if about to point out something important. Ian lazily dips a finger in Melissa's direction, saying nonchalantly that he's too lazy to say anything else. Melissa freezes for a second, not realizing what this scene was even about or what just happened. Her eyes widened as she realized exactly who Jake had just meant by his lazy gesture. The flames of anger flare up instantly, for Ian has suddenly brought into the conversation the very creep Melissa didn't even want to hear about. Melissa grimaces with rage and frustration, realizing that she should have remembered all of this from the plot of the novel by now. Memories of Jake and Ian's childhood flicker in the background, where as boys they laughed together and shared dreams. But now the scene of their feud over Yuri, the bone of contention between the once close friends, pops into her head. Jake, not really bothering to explain, points it out and imploringly demands that the engagement not be broken off. Melissa realizes with a heavy sigh that the idiot Ian has probably already told Jake the whole story. Ian imagines him telling Jake about Melissa's request to break off the engagement. Jake listens to the story with a frown on his face, leaning on his arm thoughtfully and interjecting, "Really? It sounds like nonsense in his head." And he, almost agreeing, suddenly changes his mind and demands he stop. Ian, clutching at Jake's sleeve, begs him to stay and listen, despite his protests and attempts to break free. He stares pitifully into his friend's eyes, pleading, "Please, Jake, just don't go right now." Melissa, in her thoughts, sarcastically depicts Ian humiliating himself in front of Jake, asking him to relay a request to break off the engagement. She wrinkles her nose in irritation as Ian's smirking face flashes before her eyes again and again. Suddenly her eyes go wide as she realizes something intense is up. Melissa casts a grim glance at Jake, deciding for herself that he's clearly here at Ian's insistence, not of his own free will. Jake looks at her with outright dislike, as if mentally asking, "What are you even doing here?" Melissa looks at her father suspiciously, deciding for herself that Jake really did come here at Ian's insistence. She notices the maid quickly explaining something to Jake, and guesses that she was the one who told him where to find the Duke. Melissa's imagination paints a picture of Jake listening to her father's every command and having to interfere with her engagement. She fiercely recalls how her father threatened her if she refused, and realizes it was all carefully planned. Melissa grins crookedly, realizing that just now Jake specifically mentioned breaking off the engagement out loud, so the Duke would hear everything. Melissa smiles evilly, calling Jake a little creep for his insolent antics. Jake stands between her and the Duke with a nonchalant face, provoking her even more with his silence. Melissa, barely containing her rage, demands to know who he is to tell her what to do. Her gaze turns icy as she accuses Jake of interfering in her relationship with Ian, without any right to do so. Stepping up close, Melissa hisses threateningly that if Jake keeps messing around, she'll pull out all his hair. Melissa, seething with rage, snarls that Jake is acting like an obedient mutt who's been told to listen to orders. She lunges forward, accusing him of being just a Duke's lapdog with no opinion of his own. Without letting Jake justify himself, Melissa pounces with accusations, calling him a flighty boy who is allowed too much. Jake quietly admits with a wry chuckle that he has long suspected her hatred. With a serious face, he adds that Melissa must be truly insane to be so angry. Melissa and Jake exchange heavy glances, as if competing to see whose rage will be stronger. She flopped back down on the couch with a thud, defiantly showing her irritation. Keeping his eyes on her, Jake calmly steps closer, as if accepting the imminent hostility. Melissa admits with a sigh that she knows exactly how much he hates her. But she immediately snaps back that she can't stand him herself, dropping the phrase with contempt and cold derision. Melissa, sitting on the couch, accuses Jake with a cold chuckle that she used to forgive him only because of his parentage, but now he's out of line. She scornfully refuses to consider him a brother, reminding him that real family doesn't stab you in the back. Her eyes sparkle with anger and her voice shakes with rage as she finally disowns the traitor. Jake, head down, barely conceals his guilt as he silently accepts her accusations. But Melissa has no intention of stopping and turns her icy gaze on the Duke, clearly preparing to unleash her wrath on him as well. As the tea spills onto the Duke's pants, there is an awkward silence in the room for a moment. The Duke, drenched and humiliated, is stone-faced, silently holding back his anger, trying not to show his irritation. Melissa sighs heavily, realizing that arguing with this man is like talking to a wall. She calmly declares that she wants to break off her engagement to Prince Ian, and will not have any more idle talk. Her eyes flash with a threat. If anyone dares to stand in her way, they will regret it. Melissa smiles broadly, as if everything has gone perfectly, and there is a quiet confidence inside her. Duke, retaining what remains of his dignity, stands up and abruptly throws out that if there's a complaint, let her rap it out. Ignoring his sarcasm, Melissa gracefully waves her hand as if seeing off an annoying clown. Her jewelry flies around the room from the concussion, but she just stands her ground, pleased with herself. Turning around, Melissa quietly admits that she may have been too harsh, but decides that the important thing is that everything is going according to plan. Melissa covers her face with her hands, unable to believe what's happening, and telling herself that it's all just a horrible dream. She pulls her hands away and stares angrily in front of her, clinging to the idea that this nightmare can't be real. Clenching her fists, she decides it's time to wake up from this stupid dream, once and for all. Slowly raising her hand, she gathers the resolve to slap herself on the cheek to break free from this hallucination. The slap proves to be painful, and writhing, Melissa groans in pain, realizing that somehow the dream isn't ending. Melissa slumps to the floor without strength, angry at herself for having to accept the new reality. She looks at her room, once cozy and peaceful, but now causing her only despondency and irritation. Ian's portraits hang everywhere on the walls, glittering with golden highlights and turning the room into a museum of his narcissism. A particularly large portrait shines on the right wall, where Ian is flaunting a dazzling smile. Even the left wall turns out to be stacked with images of him, making Melissa barely contain a fit of rage. Even the floor and ceiling of the room are covered with images of Ian, robbing Melissa of her last hope for calm. Clenching her fists, she angrily whispers curses, blaming Jake for the bullying. Jake's smirking face flashed into her mind, only fueling her rage more. Melissa stared in horror at the many portraits of Ian, depicting him in the most ridiculous poses and expressions. She grits her teeth in impotent anger, and tries to figure out how it was possible to put together so many pictures. Melissa tries in vain to tear the paintings off the walls, but realizes that they are attached by magic and won't budge. Clenching her fists in anger, she decides to run away from here as soon as possible, to keep at least a vestige of sanity. Glancing at the row of ridiculous portraits of Ian, she barely holds back a groan of despair. The picture of Ian holding a rose in his teeth and making defiant eyes at her is particularly infuriating. Melissa's expression goes completely blank, as if her heartache has already broken her from the inside out. Seeing another vulgar portrait of Ian, Melissa finally loses her temper, her eyes filled with rage. She rips the jewelry off her neck in a fit of rage, unable to bear the humiliation any longer. A piercing scream echoed throughout the mansion, making the walls shake. Melissa breathes heavily, barely able to stay on her feet as if squeezed dry of anger. Wiping her face with her sleeve, she angrily thinks that she was so angry that she even passed out before she escaped from this nightmare. Clenching her fists so hard that her fingers turn white, Melissa mentally vows revenge for every humiliating picture. Her face hides in a shadow of frenzy, and her thoughts resound with a promise to teach someone to respect her fists. At a frantic march, she swoops down on the frightened maid, nearly knocking her to the ground with her rapid stride. She searches the house as fiercely, as if she were going to pull Jake out of the ground with her bare hands. But as befits a master of stealth, Jake disappears without a trace, leaving Melissa to tear and thrash alone. The servants pull Melissa away from the barrel in a panic as she frantically tries to pull the non-existent Jake out of there. She frowns, suspecting that he's escaped from the manor. Melissa's lips tighten and she's finally convinced that the coward simply ran away to avoid the consequences. A flash of rage flared in her eyes, and a promise resounded in her mind. Next time he wouldn't get away alive. Turning around, she calls out to the maid, preparing to extract some information from her about Jake's escape. The maid freezes in horror when she sees the fury with which Melissa has addressed her. In a cold voice, Melissa demands to know where Jake is hiding, and the atmosphere becomes ominous. In a trembling voice, the maid confesses that she has a message from Jake if Melissa starts looking for him. When asked what exactly it was he sent, the girl panics and begins to explain that Jake supposedly wanted to talk to her himself. Unable to bear her anger, Melissa smashes through the wall next to her with a furious punch, causing everyone around her to flinch. The maid panics and points to the shattered wall in Melissa's bloody hand, but Melissa remains unfazed. Melissa hums, deciding that there's no point in thanking Jake for that taunt. Pouting with anger, she ponders that Jake probably still thinks she's crazy about the prince. An annoying picture pops into Melissa's mind of her supposedly gazing in rapt attention at Ian's portraits. But reality rudely brings her back down to earth when Jake, smirking, clearly mocks her naivete. Melissa, clutching Ian's portrait to her chest, smiles dreamily, not noticing Jake's snide laughter behind her. She begins to giggle to herself, thinking of some devious plan. The maid calls out to her worriedly, but Melissa only sinks deeper into her gloomy thoughts as she continues to smile wickedly. Abruptly snapping into a loud, insane laugh, she startles everyone around her. The maid looks at Melissa in horror, not realizing what she is going to do next. The maid looks at Melissa in a panic, frightened by her strange behavior, and asks if she's okay. Not waiting for an answer, she decides to rush to get a doctor, while Melissa laughs hysterically throughout the mansion. As Melissa continues to laugh, she notices the other servants watching her with concern and apprehension. Her face changes dramatically. Instead of mad joy, there is a dangerously cold glint in her eyes. Clenching her fist, Melissa decides that she urgently needs to have a heart-to-heart talk with someone. And it's her fist that will do the talking. With a dark grin, Melissa swears that Jake won't get away with it this time. Meanwhile, Jake, wearing a black hood, creeps cautiously down the night corridor, clinging to the walls. The shadows conceal his figure, but his light footsteps still reveal him to the attentive eyes of the servants. Melissa grins wickedly as she approaches the window, wondering who would have thought he would be the rat scaring the servants. As she jumps outside, she notices Jake trying to escape and venomously calls him a white rat. Jake abruptly turns around, noticing Melissa behind him, and panic appears on his face.